July 6th, 371 BC. The heat is oppressive, the kind that makes bronze armor feel like you're being slowly cooked alive. Two armies stand facing each other on a plain in Boeotia, and every man on that field knows they're about to participate in something that will be remembered. They just don't know yet which side the memory will favour. Let's talk about Sparta for a moment, because you need to understand what they represented to truly grasp the magnitude of what's about to happen. Sparta wasn't just a military power, it was a civilization-wide experiment in creating the perfect warrior. Every aspect of their society was engineered toward a single purpose, producing soldiers who could not be defeated. Spartan boys were inspected at birth. The weak were discarded. At age 7, the survivors entered the Agoge, a brutal training system that made modern boot camps look like summer vacation. They learned to endure pain, hunger, and exhaustion as baseline conditions of existence. They were beaten for showing weakness. They were taught that death in battle was the only acceptable end to a warrior's life, and that surrender was a fate literally worse than death. By the time a Spartan reached his 20s and earned his place in the Phalanx, he was a weapon honed by 2 decades of psychological and physical conditioning. He could march farther, fight longer, and maintain discipline under conditions that would break ordinary men, and he was surrounded by hundreds of others just like him. But the real genius of Sparta wasn't individual warriors, it was the Phalanx itself. Imagine a human tank made of overlapping shields and protruding spears. Each man's shield covered not just himself, but the man to his left. Each spear point extended beyond the shield wall, creating a bristling hedge of bronze death. When a Spartan phalanx advanced, it moved with mechanical precision, each step synchronized, each man trusting his life to the discipline of the man beside him. The psychological impact was devastating. Watching a Spartan phalanx approach was like watching an avalanche coming down a mountain. You knew it was going to crush you, and there was nothing you could do to stop it. That certainty broke armies before combat even began. For 3 centuries, this system had been undefeated in pitched battle. 300 years. Think about that for a moment. The Roman Empire at its peak lasted about 500 years. The British Empire's global dominance lasted maybe 150. Sparta's tactical supremacy had endured longer than most nations exist, and everyone knew exactly how they did it. There was no secret. The Spartans placed their elite troops, the hippies, the royal guard, on the right flank. Always, without exception. This wasn't arbitrary. It was based on the fundamental mechanics of hoplite warfare. A Greek warrior held his shield in his left hand, protecting his left side and part of the man to his left. His right side was exposed, covered only by his neighbour's shield. This created a natural psychological pressure. Every man in a phalanx wanted to drift rightward, seeking the protection of his neighbour's shield. Over the course of a battle, entire formations would creep right, like plants growing toward the sun. The Spartans had weaponized this tendency. Their right flank, packed with their best warriors and naturally drifting right, would overlap the enemy's left flank. They would then wheel inward, crushing the enemy from the side and rear. It was a hammer blow delivered with mathematical precision. Every commander in Greece knew this was coming. Every army had tried to counter it. None had succeeded. You could reinforce your own right flank, but then Sparta's elite were fighting your best troops, and Sparta's best were better. You could try to break their centre, but you'd never do it fast enough before their right flank ate your entire army from behind. You could try to match their depth, but you didn't have enough elite troops to match their concentration of force. It was a military checkmate. The only way to win was not to fight Sparta in open battle at all. Now let's shift our perspective to the other side of the field, where the Theban coalition is having what can only be described as a crisis of morale. Thebes had been living under Sparta's boot for years. After Athens lost the Peloponnesian War, Sparta became the undisputed hegemon of Greece. They were drunk on power, intervening in the internal affairs of other cities, installing pro-Spartan governments, maintaining garrisons in places they had no business being. Thebes had suffered particular humiliation. The Spartans had seized their Acropolis, the Cadmeia, in peacetime, through treachery. The Thebans had recently liberated themselves through a daring coup, killing the Spartan-backed oligarchs and driving out the garrison. But Sparta wasn't going to accept that. They were coming with an army to crush Theban independence permanently, and the Theban coalition knew they were outmatched. Their allies were there out of fear of Sparta more than confidence in Thebes. At the first sign of defeat, half of them would switch sides or simply run. The Thebans had maybe 6,000 infantry. The Spartans had 10,000, including that core of 700 Spartiates, who were worth multiple times their number in ordinary troops. In the Theban ranks, men were settling their affairs with the gods. This felt like a suicide mission. The smart play would have been to avoid battle entirely, retreat into their fortified cities, make Sparta pay for every mile of territory. But that would mean abandoning their allies, watching Sparta burn through Boeotian territory unopposed, accepting permanent subordination. General Epaminondas looked at this impossible situation and saw something nobody else could see. He saw that the Spartan system's greatest strength was also a catastrophic weakness. Sparta won the same way every time. They had perfected their tactics over centuries until they were flawless, and that perfection had made them rigid. They hadn't really innovated in generations because they hadn't needed to. Why fix what isn't broken? Why experiment when you're undefeated? But military history has a funny way of punishing success. The more dominant a system becomes, the more everyone else studies it, learns its rhythms, understands its mechanics, and eventually someone figures out that every system, no matter how perfect, has assumptions built into it, and assumptions can be exploited. Epaminondas saw that Spartan tactics assumed symmetry. They assumed the enemy would arrange their forces conventionally, because that's what rational commanders did. They assumed the enemy would try to defend against the right flank hammer blow because that was the obviously correct defensive strategy. What if you didn't play by those assumptions? The orders Epaminondas gave that morning must have sounded like madness. He stripped his right flank down to a skeleton force and told them to refuse battle, to literally pull back and avoid contact with the advancing Spartans as long as possible. He was deliberately creating a situation where the Spartan right flank would advance into empty space. His officers must have thought he'd lost his mind. You don't voluntarily give up terrain to Sparta. You don't let their elite troops maneuver freely. That's suicide. Then came the truly radical part. Epaminondas took every good unit he had, every veteran, every elite soldier, every man who could be trusted to hold under extreme pressure, and stacked them on his left flank. Not in the traditional 12-rank depth. 50 ranks deep. 50. To put that in perspective, a normal phalanx had 12 men pushing behind the front rank. Epaminondas was going to have 50 men pushing behind his front rank. He was creating a human battering ram, sacrificing width for depth, sacrificing flexibility for concentrated mass. And he was pointing this battering ram directly at the strongest point of the Spartan line, right where King Cleombrotus stood with the royal guard. This violated every principle of conventional warfare. You don't attack the enemy's strength with your strength. That's attrition, and attrition favours the larger army. You find weak points, you create advantages through manoeuvre. You don't just ram your best troops into their best troops and hope mass makes the difference, except that's exactly what Epaminondas was going to do. And leading that charge would be the most unusual military unit in Greek history, the Sacred Band of Thebes. 300 men, 150 pairs of male lovers. Now, before you get the wrong idea, this wasn't some progressive social statement. This was cold, brutal military logic. The Thebans had observed something that modern military psychology would later confirm. Soldiers fight hardest when they're protecting someone they deeply care about. A man might retreat to save his own life. He might even abandon his post if the cause seems lost. But he won't retreat if it means his lover dies. He won't run if the person he cherishes most is fighting beside him. The Sacred Band fought with a desperation that was qualitatively different from normal military discipline. They weren't fighting for abstract concepts like honour or city. They were fighting to keep the person they loved alive. Each pair operated as a micro-unit, covering each other's weaknesses, reading each other's movements with the intuition that comes from intimate knowledge. The Spartans had individual excellence and systematic discipline. The Sacred Band had something harder to quantify, but just as powerful. Emotional bonds that made them fight like trapped animals protecting their mates. Epaminondas was gambling everything on a single throw of the dice. His entire battle plan depended on that 50-deep column of Theban and Boeotian troops spearheaded by the Sacred Band smashing through the Spartan elite before the rest of his army collapsed. If they failed, the Theban coalition would be destroyed. If they succeeded, well, the the world would change. King Cleombrotus looked at the Theban formation and saw what he expected to see, an army that didn't know what it was doing. Their line looked crooked, asymmetrical, almost broken. Their right flank was pulling back. Were they already retreating before the battle even started? Their left flank was bunched up in that weird, deep column. It looked amateurish. To a Spartan commander who had won every battle by following the playbook, this looked like an opponent who didn't understand the fundamentals of warfare. Cleombrotus wasn't worried. He was contemptuous. These Thebans were about to learn why you don't challenge Sparta in open battle. He gave the order. The Spartan army advanced, their war pipes playing that eerie, droning melody that had preceded so many victories. The right flank, packed with the royal guard and the best Spartiates, moved forward with that perfect, terrifying discipline. They were heading for the Theban left flank, expecting the usual collision of shield walls. The Theban right flank continued its withdrawal, refusing battle, their pipes playing slow and deliberate as they backed away from contact. The Spartan right advanced into increasingly empty space. What was happening here? Were the Thebans refusing battle entirely? Was their left flank going to try to fight while their right ran away? And then the sacred band, at the head of that monstrous 50-deep column, began their advance. They didn't spread out to match the Spartan frontage. They stayed compressed, a spear point of concentrated humanity aimed at a single section of the Spartan line. They were moving at the double quick, covering ground fast, building momentum. The Spartans in the Royal Guard sector saw them coming and adjusted their shields, set their spears. They'd taken charges before. They were ready. They were not ready. When that Theban column hit, it wasn't a battle. It was a collision between unstoppable force and immovable object. The physics were brutal and simple. The front rank of Spartans had 12 men pushing behind them. The front rank of Thebans had 50 men pushing behind them. Imagine being in that front Spartan rank. You've braced yourself, shield up, spear ready. You've done this 100 times in training and battle. You know how to absorb a charge. Then 50 men's worth of momentum hits your shield, all at once, all concentrated on you and the handful of men to either side of you. You don't stand your ground. You can't. The human body has limits. Your feet lose traction. Your shield arm buckles. The men behind you are trying to push back, but they can't match the pressure. You're being driven backward and you can't stop it. If you fall, you're dead. Not from enemy weapons necessarily, but from being trampled by the press of bodies behind you, your own men, unable to stop their backward momentum. The Spartan front ranks didn't break because they were cowards. They broke because physics doesn't care about courage. They were being literally crushed by superior mass concentrated at a single point. And into that chaos came the sacred band, fighting with a fury that transcended normal battlefield aggression. Each pair was a miniature killing machine. When one warrior's spear arm tired, his lover covered him. When one took a wound, the other went berserk with rage and fear. They weren't trying to hold a position or achieve some tactical objective. They were trying to punch through to the Spartan king, and nothing was going to stop them. The Spartan Royal Guard was the best of the best, the cream of an already elite military. They'd trained their entire lives for moments exactly like this. They held their ground with a tenacity that would have broken any normal attack. But this wasn't a normal attack. The pressure was inhuman, relentless. Men in the front ranks were being crushed against their own shields, unable to breathe, unable to see, simply trying to stay on their feet while dozens of warriors pushed from behind. The wounded couldn't fall back. There was no room to retreat. They died where they stood, or were trampled when they fell. And still the Theban column pushed forward. Inch by bloody inch they were driving the Spartan elite back. For the first time in living memory, the invincible Spartan right flank wasn't advancing. It wasn't even holding position. It was retreating. Then someone in the sacred band, we don't know who, history didn't record the name, got his spear point through a gap in the shield wall and found King Cleombrotus. The cry that went up changed everything. The king was down. In Spartan culture, that was more than a tactical setback. It was a cosmic violation. Spartan kings led from the front specifically because their presence was supposed to be invincible. They were descended from Heracles. They were touched by the gods. They didn't fall in battle, except one just had. The Spartan royal guard went berserk, not with fear or panic, but with rage and desperation. They weren't fighting for victory anymore. They weren't even fighting for their own lives. They were fighting to recover the king's body. If the Thebans took it, paraded it through their cities, desecrated it, that was unthinkable. That would be a stain on Spartan honor that would never wash out. They got him. At horrific cost, dying by the dozens, they managed to pull Cleombrotus's corpse back into their lines. It was an act of incredible bravery and incredible stupidity. Because while the absolute best warriors in the Spartan army were dying to recover a dead body, the rest of the Spartan army was watching. The Spartan Phalanx wasn't a monolithic block of elite Spartiates. That core of 700 full citizens was surrounded by thousands of perioikoi, free non-citizens who lived in Spartan territory, and representatives from allied cities. These men fought for Sparta out of legal obligation or fear, not fanatical devotion. They watched the royal guard getting slaughtered. They watched the king fall. They watched that Theban column continuing its relentless push, despite taking massive casualties of its own. And they did the math that every soldier does in a losing battle. What are my chances if I stay versus my chances if I run? The collapse started slowly, then accelerated. A few men at the back of the formation started edging away, then a dozen, then 100. The Spartan centre and left flank, which hadn't even made contact with the enemy yet, simply dissolved. This was the moment Epaminondas had been engineering. His withdrawn right flank hadn't just been avoiding combat, it had been a psychological weapon. The Spartan right wing had advanced so far trying to catch them that they were now dangerously separated from their centre. When the centre broke, there was no one to support the elite troops still locked in combat with the Theban column. The rout became a massacre. Thousands of men threw away their shields, the ultimate symbol of disgrace in Greek warfare, the one piece of equipment you were never supposed to abandon, and ran for their lives. The disciplined Spartan phalanx that had marched onto the field that morning became a terrified mob streaming away from the battlefield. For the Thebans and their allies, this was catharsis decades in the making. Every man on that field had a story of Spartan arrogance, Spartan cruelty, Spartan occupation. The helots and perioikoi in the Spartan ranks had it even worse. They'd been enslaved or subjugated by these same Spartiates who were now running for their lives. There was no mercy. The fleeing Spartans were cut down as they ran, hunted through the fields, killed when they begged for quarter. The Boeotians weren't just winning a battle, they were exercising generations of humiliation. The Spartan royal guard, meanwhile, had completed their mission. They had the king's body. The Theban column had finally stopped its advance, having punched through the elite core and achieved its objective. The survivors of the royal guard, maybe 300 men out of the 700 Spartiates who had started the battle in that sector, found themselves in a suddenly silent pocket of the battlefield. Around them, their army had evaporated. The Theban army, victorious and still relatively intact, was now turning its attention to them. They were completely surrounded, outnumbered 10-1, exhausted from the most brutal hand-to-hand combat any of them had ever experienced. And they faced a choice that violated everything they'd been taught since childhood. Spartan law was absolute and clear. Victory or death. A Spartan returns with his shield or on it. Surrender is unthinkable. Retreat is unthinkable. You fight where you stand until you win or die. But the commander of the survivors, the Polemarch, whose name was Deinon, looked around and saw something that changed the equation. These weren't just soldiers. They were the genetic core of Sparta itself. Of the 700 Spartiates who had marched to battle, over 400 were dead. Another 300 were standing here, surrounded. If they made a glorious last stand, Sparta would lose almost its entire citizen body in a single afternoon. Sparta's population of full citizens had been declining for generations. They had strict rules about who could be a Spartiate. You had to be born to 2 Spartan citizens, you had to survive the agoge, you had to contribute to a common mess. The population was already dangerously small. Losing 700 citizens in one day would be a demographic catastrophe from which Sparta might never recover. Deinon made a calculation that no Spartan commander had ever made before. Better the shame of survival than the extinction of Sparta itself. A herald walked out of the circle of shields, unarmed, carrying the staff that marked him as a messenger. He walked across the corpse-strewn field, through the blood and the bodies of his friends and comrades, to the Theban lines. His message was simple. We request a truce to recover our dead. In Greek military culture, This was an unambiguous admission of total defeat. You only asked to recover your dead if you'd lost the battle so badly that you couldn't hold the field. It was a formal surrender in everything but name. Epaminondas could have said no, could have demanded unconditional surrender, could have ordered one final charge to wipe out the survivors. Nobody would have blamed him. These were the same Spartans who had occupied the Cadmea, who had interfered in Theban politics, who had treated Thebes as a subordinate state for years. But Epaminondas understood something subtle and brilliant. Killing these survivors would create martyrs. They'd become another Thermopylae, a glorious last stand that would inspire Spartan vengeance for generations. Songs would be written about their heroic sacrifice. Children would be told their stories. The legend of Spartan invincibility would actually be strengthened by a heroic death. But letting them live, forcing them to formally admit defeat, making them gather their dead under the pitying eyes of their conquerors, sending them home bearing the weight of failure, that would be a wound that would never heal. That would break something fundamental in the Spartan psyche. He granted the truce. The surviving Spartans began the most humiliating task imaginable. They walked among the dead, identifying bodies, lifting them onto shields that now served as improvised stretchers. Every corpse was evidence of their failure. Every step was a step deeper into dishonor. Epaminondas had one more psychological knife to twist. He publicly invited Sparta's allies to come recover their dead first. Dozens of them returned to the battlefield, gathered their casualties, and left. Then Epaminondas made a show of having the dead separated. Allies on one side, Spartiates on the other. Why this theatrical separation? Because Sparta had been lying about casualty figures for years. After every battle, they'd inflate the number of allied dead and minimize their own losses, preserving the myth that Spartiates were nearly invulnerable. By physically separating the bodies, Epaminondas was conducting a public audit. He was forcing Sparta to admit exactly how many of their precious citizens had fallen. The survivors carried the dead back to their camp, then began the long march home. They weren't marching as an army, they were walking as a funeral procession. The news spread ahead of them, rippling across Greece like a shock wave. Sparta has been defeated in open battle. Their king is dead. Over 400 Spartiates have fallen. The news reached Sparta during the Gymnopaedia, a religious festival celebrating physical perfection, discipline, and military excellence. The entire city was in celebration mode. Young men demonstrating their training, choruses singing hymns to Apollo, the community celebrating everything that made Sparta special. A runner staggered into the city and delivered his message to the ephors, the 5 magistrates who were the real power in Sparta. The historian Xenophon, who admired Sparta and had fought alongside them, described what happened next with a kind of horrified awe. The ephors understood immediately that panic would be more destructive than the defeat itself. If Sparta's population lost faith in their own invincibility, if the myth shattered all at once, the entire social structure would collapse. So they made a decision that was coldly, brutally brilliant. The festival would continue. No public mourning, no announcement of the defeat. Business as usual. They sent private messages to the families of the fallen, and here's where it gets truly dystopian. The families were ordered to show joy in public, pride. Their sons and husbands had achieved the highest honor, death, in battle for Sparta. To mourn would be to insult their sacrifice, to suggest that dying for Sparta was somehow a tragedy. So the mothers and wives of the dead walked through the festival with smiles on their faces, accepting congratulations, radiating pride, while their hearts were breaking. The men who were mourning, who were in tears, were the families of the survivors, because in Spartan logic, surviving a defeat was infinitely worse than dying in battle. Think about the psychological torture of this. You've just learned your son is dead, cut down in the worst military defeat in Spartan history, and you're required to celebrate. You're forced to tell your neighbours how proud you are, how he achieved glory, how this is exactly what you hoped for him. You have to lock your grief behind your teeth and smile. When the survivors finally arrived in Sparta, they entered a nightmare. The entire city watched them in cold silence. No welcome, no relief that they'd survived, just judgment. Under Spartan law, men who retreated or survived a defeat were branded tresants, tremblers, cowards. They lost their citizenship. No one could speak to them, eat with them, do business with them. Their families were shamed by association. They became untouchables in their own city. But here's the problem. There were hundreds of survivors. Almost half the Spartan citizen body had technically violated the code by surviving. How do you exile or execute half your remaining military force? How do you maintain your laws when applying them would destroy your ability to defend yourself? Sparta faced a paradox that their rigid system had never anticipated. They needed these men desperately. Thebes was still a threat. Their empire was crumbling. They couldn't afford to throw away hundreds of experienced warriors. But their entire social structure was based on absolute adherence to the code. Compromise was weakness. Flexibility was corruption. King Agesilaus, one of Sparta's most respected leaders, proposed a solution that was both clever and devastating. He stood before the assembly and spoke a single sentence that would echo through history. Let the laws sleep for a day. Not forgiveness, not amnesty, not a change to the law, just a suspension. Just for today. Tomorrow the laws would have full force again. But today they would sleep. It was a legal fiction, a pragmatic dodge that saved Sparta from immediate collapse. The survivors weren't pardoned because that would imply the law was wrong. They were simply not punished. The shame remained, but they kept their citizenship and could fight again. But the cost of this compromise was enormous. For the first time in Spartan history, they'd admitted that their sacred laws could be bent for convenience. The iron rigidity that had been Sparta's greatest strength had cracked, and everyone knew it. Epaminondas wasn't finished. While Sparta was paralyzed by internal crisis, he did something that previous enemies had, only dreamed about. He invaded Laconia itself. For centuries, Sparta's territory had been considered inviolable, not because it was fortified. Sparta had no walls, considering walls cowardly, but because attacking Sparta at home was suicide. Their army would destroy any invader. Except their army was broken. Their military reputation was shattered. The allies who had feared them now smelled blood. Epaminondas marched through Laconia, burning and plundering, and the Spartans could only watch from behind hastily erected defences. The city that had terrorised Greece for 3 centuries couldn't defend its own territory. Then came the masterstroke. Epaminondas marched into Messenia and declared it free. Messenia was the foundation of the entire Spartan system. The Messenians were helots, state-owned slaves who worked the land and provided all the agricultural labour that allowed Spartan citizens to be full-time warriors. There were probably 7 helots for every Spartiate. They were kept in line through terror and occasional mass killings. By liberating Messenia and helping them found a fortified capital at Messene, Epaminondas didn't just cost Sparta some territory, he destroyed their economic model. Suddenly Spartan citizens had to farm their own land or hire labourers. They couldn't afford to spend all their time training. The machine that produced the perfect warrior had just lost its fuel supply. The impact was devastating and permanent. Within a generation, Sparta went from superpower to regional curiosity. Their army shrank, their influence evaporated, the coalition they'd led dissolved. Cities that had sent representatives to Sparta's assemblies now ignored their demands. By the time Alexander the Great conquered the known world a few decades later, Sparta was so irrelevant he didn't even bother attacking them. They were a tourist attraction, a living museum of a military culture that had once ruled Greece. What destroyed Sparta? Not a bigger army, not a new technology, not even the loss of 400 citizens, devastating though that was. What destroyed Sparta was the shattering of an idea. For 3 centuries, everyone believed Sparta was unbeatable. That belief shaped how wars were fought, how alliances were formed, how politics worked. Sparta's reputation was a force multiplier more powerful than any weapon. Epaminondas broke that belief. He demonstrated that Spartan tactics could be defeated through innovation and concentration of force. He showed that Spartan discipline could be psychologically broken. He proved that their system, for all its perfection, was rigid and couldn't adapt. The Battle of Leuctra wasn't just a military victory, it was a paradigm shift. After Leuctra, every commander in Greece started thinking differently about tactics, about the phalanx, about the nature of military power itself. The old rules had been rewritten. Here's the deeper lesson. Invincibility is always an illusion. Every system, no matter how perfect it seems, has assumptions built into it. Those assumptions work brilliantly until someone figures out how to violate them. Then the whole structure collapses. Sparta assumed enemies would fight conventionally because that was rational. They assumed their right flank hammer blow was unstoppable because it had never been stopped. They assumed their discipline and training made them superior warrior for warrior. All true until someone questioned those assumptions. Epaminondas asked, "What if I don't fight conventionally? What if I don't try to stop the hammer blow but instead let it swing at air while I attack somewhere else? What if I match your elite with concentrated mass instead of trying to match their individual quality?" By questioning assumptions everyone else took for granted, he found the crack in the seemingly perfect shield. This pattern repeats throughout history. The Mongols destroyed armoured knights by refusing to meet them in pitched battle. The English longbow broke French cavalry at Crécy by changing the range equation. Blitzkrieg shattered static defences by moving too fast for them to respond. Asymmetric warfare defeats conventional militaries by refusing to fight the kind of war the conventional military is designed to win. Every dominant system carries the seeds of its own defeat. The more perfectly optimized it becomes for a specific context, the more vulnerable it is to someone who changes the context. Sparta optimized for one type of warfare to the exclusion of all else. They perfected the hoplite phalanx to such a degree that they couldn't imagine warfare working any other way. That perfection made them brittle. When someone found a way to break their system, they had no backup, no flexibility, no ability to adapt. So what are the Spartan phalanxes of our time? What systems dominate so completely that we can't imagine them being challenged? What assumptions do we take for granted because they've always worked before? Every generation thinks it has figured out the permanent solution to something, the unbeatable business model, the perfected military doctrine, the economic system that has transcended the boom-bust cycle, the technology that can't be disrupted. And every generation discovers that permanence is an illusion. Someone, somewhere, is looking at your perfect system and asking, what if the assumptions are wrong? What if there's a different way? The question isn't whether our invincible systems will fall. The question is whether we'll be rigid like Sparta, unable to adapt when someone breaks our paradigm, or whether we'll be flexible enough to question our own assumptions before someone else does it for us. Leuctra teaches us that the greatest danger isn't the enemy who's bigger or stronger. It's the enemy who thinks differently, who sees what you've taken for granted, who finds the flaw in your perfection. Sparta spent 3 centuries perfecting their system. Epaminondas spent 1 afternoon destroying it. That's the nature of paradigm shifts. They don't happen gradually, they happen suddenly, catastrophically, when someone finally figures out what everyone else missed. The giants always fall. The question is, are you the giant or the one with the sling?